Ask almost anyone what makes Stegosaurus unusual, and there is a good chance the answer involves a second brain. It is one of the most repeated dinosaur facts in existence, taught in classrooms, printed in children's books, and recycled in documentaries for more than a century straight. It is also completely wrong, and what modern science actually found sitting inside that space is stranger and considerably more interesting than the myth it replaced. Stegosaurus carried one of the smallest brains relative to body size of any dinosaur ever discovered, roughly the size of a walnut, tucked inside a skull barely larger than a house cat's, on a body stretching close to 30 feet long and weighing several tons. That mismatch between a massive body and a tiny brain is exactly why the second brain idea caught on in the first place over 100 years ago, and it took an entirely separate piece of forensic evidence pulled from the hip bone of one of Stegosaurus's own predators to finally settle a second, completely unrelated question about how this animal actually survived. The obstacle that defines Stegosaurus research at the molecular level is even more severe than it is for most extinct dinosaurs. Genetic material has a hard ceiling on preservation, degrading beyond recovery after roughly 1 to 1.5 million years under even the most favorable cold, dry conditions. Stegosaurus went extinct approximately 145 million years ago, at the close of the Jurassic period, a gap more than 100 times beyond that outer limit, and old enough that no soft tissue or collagen discovery on the scale of what has been found in some younger dinosaurs has ever been documented for this species. Whatever genetic code this animal carried is gone permanently, and no method available to science now or in the foreseeable future can bring it back. What science actually revealed about Stegosaurus instead came from two entirely different directions. A century-old anatomical mystery finally getting corrected, and a piece of direct physical evidence proving exactly how this animal used the weapon on the end of its tail. The mystery began in the 1800s when Yale paleontologist Othniel Charles Marsh, examining the vertebrae of Stegosaurus and the giant sauropod Camarasaurus, noticed something strange: an empty cavity in the spinal canal directly above the hips, dramatically larger than the space the actual brain occupied inside the skull. Marsh described it as a posterior brain case, and the idea that Stegosaurus carried a second brain in its hindquarters to help coordinate its massive hind legs and its dangerous tail took hold almost immediately, spreading well beyond academic circles into general public understanding of the species within just a few decades of Marsh's original description. The idea had obvious appeal. A creature this large, moving a tail this dangerous, controlled by a brain this small, seemed to demand some kind of biological workaround, and the second brain explanation offered exactly that in a single memorable image that required no further scientific justification to feel intuitively satisfying. The theory spread into textbooks, museum placards, and popular science writing, and it stayed there for well over a century, repeated as established fact long after most paleontologists studying the actual anatomy had already abandoned it as biologically implausible, a gap between expert consensus and public understanding that would persist for generations. If you're finding this interesting, be sure to subscribe to understand more DNA from the past. No vertebrate animal, living or extinct, has ever been confirmed to operate two functioning brains, and modern neuroanatomy makes the idea a non-starter on basic biological grounds. A second brain would require its own specialized neural tissue, its own blood supply, and its own developmental origin, none of which the fossil evidence supports. What modern researchers have proposed instead centers on a structure called a glycogen body, an organ found today in the sacral spinal cord of living birds, rich in glycogen, an energy storage molecule capable of supplying glucose directly to nearby nervous tissue during periods of high demand. Sauropod researcher Matt Weddell and dinosaur brain specialist Emily Buchholz have both pointed to this structure as the strongest anatomical parallel available, proposing that a similar energy storage organ, positioned to fuel the powerful muscles controlling the hind limbs and tail, is a far more plausible explanation than a functioning second brain ever was, particularly given how metabolically demanding it would have been to swing a spiked tail this heavy with any real speed or control. An enlarged nerve bundle, essentially a relay hub handling reflexive movement in the tail and hind legs without needing every signal to travel all the way to the skull and back, remains a serious alternative explanation as well, and researchers have generally treated the two ideas as complementary rather than competing, since a single cavity could plausibly have housed both kinds of tissue working together. What makes this correction more honest than most is that researchers studying it have been direct about what remains unresolved. This exact kind of oversized sacral cavity shows up only in stegosaurs and in sauropods, two dinosaur groups that are not closely related to each other, and neither of which sits anywhere near the lineage of theropods that eventually gave rise to birds. That leaves the glycogen body comparison as a genuinely useful anatomical parallel rather than a settled evolutionary inheritance, since the structure would have had to evolve independently in stegosaurs and sauropods, rather than being passed down from a shared ancestor also carrying it, a detail that turns a tidy answer into a considerably stranger evolutionary coincidence. Paleontologists studying the question have called the underlying reason for the cavity's size a legitimately unresolved puzzle, not a fully closed case, and have been careful not to overstate how much the bird comparison actually explains. What is settled is only the negative result. Whatever filled that space in Stegosaurus, it was never a second brain capable of independent thought, and the century of textbooks that suggested otherwise were repeating a 19th century guess that modern anatomy never actually supported in the first place, one that survived far longer in public imagination than it ever did among the scientists actually studying the bones themselves. The second correction came from a completely different kind of evidence. Not anatomy, but direct combat damage, preserved in bone rather than inferred from comparative structures. For years, paleontologists debated whether the four spikes at the end of a stegosaurus tail, a structure now informally called a thagomizer, were genuine weapons or simply display structures meant to look impressive without ever actually being used in a fight, the same way some modern animals grow elaborate ornamentation that plays no real defensive role at all. Settling that question required finding actual damage, not just plausible-looking anatomy. Paleontologist Kenneth Carpenter and colleagues examined a Stegosaurus neck plate recovered from a quarry in Utah and found a distinct U-shaped notch cut into its edge, a shape that corresponded closely to the front of an Allosaurus jaw, the leading predator sharing Stegosaurus's late Jurassic ecosystem. Since the plates were solid bone with little surrounding flesh worth biting into, the missing chunk looked far more consistent with an attack than with scavenging after death, when a predator would have had far easier, meatier targets available elsewhere on the carcass entirely. The same research examined 51 individual Stegosaurus tail spikes recovered from multiple sites and found that roughly 10% showed broken tips with bone that had subsequently healed, direct physical evidence that these animals were regularly using their tails hard enough to snap the ends off entirely, and surviving the encounter long enough afterward to grow new bone around the damage. Subscribe to not miss the next one. The single clearest piece of evidence arrived from the opposite side of the fight entirely. Paleontologist Robert Baker and colleagues examined an adult Allosaurus skeleton recovered from the Morrison Formation in Wyoming and found a puncture wound driven straight through the pubis bone, part of the hip, in a location that would have required real precision and flexibility from whatever delivered the strike, since a Stegosaurus tail would have needed to reach up and under an attacking predator to land a hit there at all, a maneuver requiring exactly the kind of controlled, deliberate tail movement the fracture and healing statistics already suggested these animals were capable of. The wound was cone-shaped, and its size and geometry matched Stegosaurus tail spikes recovered from the same rock layers almost exactly, leaving little ambiguity about what had caused it. A massive infection had eaten away a section of bone roughly the size of a baseball around the wound, likely spreading upward into the surrounding thigh muscle, intestines, and reproductive organs, and the complete absence of healing around the injury indicated that Allosaurus ultimately died from the resulting infection, rather than surviving it the way the animals with healed spike fractures had. Baker presented these findings at the Geological Society of America's annual meeting in 2014, describing an attack landing squarely in one of the few locations on an Allosaurus that a Stegosaurus tail, aimed with real accuracy under pressure, could actually reach, and one capable of ending the fight days or weeks after the strike itself, rather than in the moment, a slow, agonizing death sentence delivered by an animal popular science had spent a century treating as fundamentally harmless. Taken together, these two corrections describe an animal built almost nothing like the version that dominated popular science for more than 100 years. Not a lumbering herbivore requiring a backup brain just to manage its own body, but an animal whose actual neuroanatomy remains a genuine, still debated puzzle involving energy storage and reflexive nerve control rather than independent thought, one that current researchers are careful to describe as unresolved rather than pretending a tidy answer exists where one genuinely does not. And not a passive plant eater carrying decorative spikes for show, the kind of harmless ornamentation sometimes seen in living animals today, but an animal capable of driving a bony weapon through the hip of an active, fully grown predator with enough force and precision to kill it outright, days after the strike itself. Neither correction came from DNA, because DNA from an animal this old was never going to survive to be tested in the first place, not with any technology that exists now, or that anyone studying ancient biomolecules realistically expects to exist in the foreseeable future. Both corrections came instead from exactly the kind of evidence that actually can survive 150 million years, bone, carefully re-examined, using questions 19th century paleontologists never thought to ask, and techniques they never had access to in the first place. What remains true about Stegosaurus, after both corrections, is that the century-old image built around a slow, simple-minded giant needing extra help just to function was wrong in nearly every direction that mattered. The brain question remains open, honestly unresolved, exactly where the researchers studying it say it should sit for now, rather than being replaced by one confident myth with another equally confident guess, dressed up in more modern language. The tail question, by contrast, is closed, settled by a fatal wound preserved in the hip of the one predator that miscalculated the reach of an animal it should have respected, a single fossil doing more to answer the question than a century of speculation about display versus defense ever managed on its own. 66 million years after the last non-avian dinosaur died, and roughly 80 million years after Stegosaurus itself disappeared, the fossil record finally caught up to what the bones had been showing paleontologists the entire time, sitting in drawers and display cases across multiple continents, waiting for anyone to look closely enough and ask the right question to actually see it.